Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. Think of these inventions: a car that flies, a way to extract downed military pilots in remote locations, or a way to teach pilots without flying with a flight simulator. Well, invent any one of these and your name goes down in the history books, but all three? That person was Robert Fulton. Our guest today is Ben Cruson. He's the town historian for Newtown, Connecticut, and that's the town where Robert Fulton created all those inventions. Ben's going to be along in just a moment with some fabulous insights into Robert Fulton's frankly incredible life. This week's trivia question: when the Founding Fathers back in 1787 couldn't agree on how to form a new government for America and everything was falling apart, which Connecticut statesman defused the crisis and saved the day? Well, stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. When you hear the name Robert Fulton, well, you'll be excused for thinking we're talking about the inventor of the steamboat, because he did invent the steamboat. But there's another Robert Fulton, and he also just happens to be an incredible inventor as well. But you can distinguish him from the first Robert Fulton by his middle name, a distinct middle name, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. And this second Robert Fulton, well, he's not related to the steamboat inventor, at least as far as their family can determine. What is known about this second Robert Fulton, though, is that he was born in New York City and then relocated to Newtown, Connecticut, which is where all of his many inventions came to life, particularly the one he's best known for, the Airphibian, or flying car. Well, who better to tell us his story than the Town Historian of Newtown, Ben Cruson. Ben, when you talk about famous people from Newtown, near that top of the list, you've got to have Robert Fulton. Now, here's a guy who was an unbelievable inventor of, the Airphibian, the flying car, and there's so many other things he did, and we'll get into all of this, and he did this famous round-the-world motorcycle trip that we'll talk about. But, when you talk about all of us, right, come from parents of some sort, and this guy's father was the president of Mack Trucks back when Mack Trucks were brand new. And on his mother's side, his grandfather was a stagecoach operator cross-country in a business that eventually became Greyhound Bus. So you might say he had some sort of transportation DNA in him, which will come into play later. But what I'd love to open up and have you talk about is the middle name that Robert Fulton Sr., who I guess is not related to the steamboat inventor from what we understand, but he gave his son a very interesting middle name based on an acquaintance he had, which may have sort of defined his life. Could you tell us that part of the story?
Yeah, he gave his son the middle name Edison because Thomas Edison was a friend of Robert Fulton Sr. There was an interview that was done late in Robert Fulton's life where he commented that given the fact that he had Edison as a middle name and his name was Robert Fulton, obviously echoing the name of the steamboat inventor, he had no choice but to become an inventor. I mean, this was a foregone conclusion as soon as he was named. That's what he went on to do.
He was a man of amazing sayings as well, for this Robert Fulton who we're talking about. One of the things that I loved was a saying he came up with, which was one measure of a man is what he does when he has nothing to do, which is, I think, kind of speaks to his life. Now, he was a man of means, right? His dad certainly was pretty wealthy, and he was sent off to Switzerland, to Lausanne, Switzerland for schooling, and then Exeter and Choate for prep school, Harvard for architecture, University of Vienna for his master's in architecture. But when he was 12 and 14 years old, he got to do two things. Could you tell us about this? Because I think this is amazing what he got to experience there.
Yeah, when he was 12, he was on one of the first commercial flights between Miami and Havana, Cuba, which, as a 12-year-old, that obviously must have had an impact on him. You've got this relatively new technology. It's brand new to the commercial business of these commercial airlines. He gets to be one of the first people to experience it and to see what flying is like. He also had the opportunity a couple of years later to fly to Egypt and to see the opening of King Tut's tomb. I don't know exactly what his father's connections were that made that possible, but obviously that was an experience that had a big impact on him as well, to get out and experience that sort of wonder and adventure of experiencing something like that.
And this is something that was sort of a pattern that followed him throughout his entire life, this exploration and adventure and whatnot. And of course, invention was, we'll talk about. So this was in the early 1920s. A decade later now, he's getting out of college. He's 23 years old, and he decides he's going to get on a motorcycle and go to 22 nations over 18 months, 40,000 miles on this motorcycle. Tell us about this trip and some of the highlights of it.
It's an amazing trip. And you have to realize he didn't really have any experience with motorcycles before going on this trip. It was a spur of the moment decision. According to him, he just sort of blurted it out at a dinner party when he was asked what he was going to do now. He was able to get the motorcycle and he set off from London across Europe. And he doesn't say much about Europe. Obviously, he wasn't very impressed with that. He had probably already experienced most of it. But then he gets into Turkey, where he spends a night in a Turkish jail because that's the safest place that the villagers decide that they can keep him. He ends up getting in a motorcycle accident. He plunges, I think it's 12 feet off of a ravine, and ends up getting knocked unconscious, gets saved by some nearby villagers. I mean, his motorcycle is constantly breaking down and having issues. He's got to learn how to fix it on the fly. He goes into Afghanistan, which at that point was off the map for most Europeans, most Westerners. Very few Westerners had been there. And so it was an adventure not only for him, but also for the people living there, who many of them had never seen a European before. He ends up accidentally wandering into a British military zone where he gets shot at by local tribesmen. It's just absolutely incredible, the adventures he has as he goes down through the Middle East, through South Asia, and then back up the coast through China to Tokyo.
Now, I read somewhere that in a lot of these locations, he obviously didn't speak the language either and had to use hand signals. And in one village, he was getting directions, I guess, and the villagers signaled with their hands about the danger of going to the next village. Did you hear that story too?
Yeah, he wrote a book about his adventure called One Man Caravan, which is an absolute delight to read. He was a gifted writer in addition to being everything else he was. And he tells that story and talks about the fact that, they're telling him not to go there. That town is full of thieves and murderers and scoundrels. And, if you value your life and your belongings, don't go anywhere near it. Well, as I recall, it was the villagers from that next town that actually saved him after his motorcycle accident in Turkey. He's talking to them. Obviously, they're nice people. They came, they helped him, they rescued him, they nursed him back to health. He mentions that he just came from that other village, and the villagers are saying, oh, we can't believe that you survived that. Those people are thieves and murderers and scoundrels, and don't ever go anywhere near there again. Which, there's obviously a moral lesson somewhere in there. But his trip is just full of those kinds of stories.
I just love it. He then goes into this streak of inventing things. One thing that he invented that was very interesting, and not a lot of talk about this, but I believe I'm pronouncing it correctly when I call it the gun aerostructor, which was, well, you tell us, what was that all about?
So he originally invented basically a flight simulator. It was supposed to be a flight simulator to train fighter pilots and pilots for bombers, that type of thing. But apparently the military wasn't interested. I don't know if they had something else that was comparable at the time or what. Maybe they just figured they didn't have time to put too many people through it right in the middle of the war. What he ended up doing was he ended up going back and redesigning it as a training device for air gunners, the extra gunners on fighters or bombers or whatever, to train them to shoot at moving objects and things of that sort.
Now, when we're talking about flying, this was something that was in his blood. As you say, he went from Miami to Havana back in the early 20s, flying over water, which must have been very scary, frankly, with that brand new technology at the time. But here he is now logging quite a few miles, but he's frustrated as he has to travel from place to place that, he's got to, first of all, take a flight, then he's got to get either a cab or somehow get, ground transportation. And he comes up with this idea of, well, why do I need two separate ones? A plane and a car are kind of similar. Why can't I just blend them together? And alas, came the Airphibian in the 1940s. Tell us his story.
He had gotten a job just after his motorcycle trip. During his motorcycle trip, he took tons of not only photographic film, but also cinematic film. He had a hand-cranked, I think it was a 35 millimeter camera. The film footage he shot impressed the executives at Pan American Airways. And so they ended up giving him a job basically as a cinematographer to them to document some of their flights, the new planes that they were working, such as the Pan American Clipper, which was a flying boat, which also may have, inspired the Airphibian, both of them being planes that can also work on other surfaces. He obviously had to travel for this job. He wanted to combine his ability to move through the sky and through the land into the same vehicle. So he must have been working on this through World War II, because in 1946, he completes his prototype of what he called the Airphibian. And the Airphibian was, when it was all put together, imagine like a single-engine Cessna, kind of a small plane. But what it could do was the front section that has the passenger compartment and the engine in it could be separated from the wings and the tail of the plane once it was landed. And you could take the propeller off of the front of it, and you could leave that with the tail and wing section, and you could just drive off with the passenger part. And so, he was able to drive to airports wherever he had to go, and he could just disconnect the back of the plane and drive right off to wherever he needed to go.
What's amazing is you can see these videos on YouTube, and you actually can make the transformation in 5 minutes.
Yeah, or at least you can if you're Robert Fulton, then you know how it works. But no, yeah, it looks like it was a fairly simple process, which is probably the most amazing thing about it. Not only that it was quick to transform, but also that it was then safe to fly through the air.
Now, his plane would fly at about 110 miles an hour, and the car could go 55 miles an hour, which in the 1940s was perfectly, that's all you needed. And the problem was, though, right, he starts building these things, and what happens? I guess he can't finish his enterprise.
Yeah, so he inherited, quite a bit of money from his parents, but he was constantly inventing things, tinkering with things, using the money for travel and things like that. You could only produce so many Airphibians on the money that your parents left you, no matter how rich they are. So he produced, it was somewhere between 8 and 12 Airphibians. As far as I know, he never sold any of them. I don't know exactly what happened to all of them. But he eventually ran out of money. He wanted to develop it into a commercially available product, and so he ended up selling the production rights to another company. And unfortunately, that company never invested in producing them for whatever reason, and the project just sort of died there. He kept his Airphibian, which he continued using throughout his life, but it never became a commercial success.
And you're right, I have no idea what happened to the others as well. I do know that the prototype is on display at the Smithsonian. That is the one that is still in one piece and is still available for people to see. The other part of this story that's amazing is the precursor to the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, was the Civil Aeronautics Administration. As I understand it from some research I did, I guess they had 20 inspectors assigned to checking this out. But they ran into problems. They couldn't do it quickly because all the regulations, all the tests that they had were designed to have an airplane land on a runway, not to have a vehicle then drive on roads. And therefore, they were stymied in their attempts to approve it. And unfortunately, the actual certificate to fly this didn't come until after he sold the rights to the production. And alas, that's the story. But it's a fascinating story. Now, at this point, he had moved to Newtown. I guess he was born in New York, but he bought this 30-acre tract in Newtown on Orchard Hill Road, where the only grass landing strip approved by the FAA in Fairfield County, Connecticut, is on his former property. Tell us what it's like in that section of Newtown.
It's definitely one of the more rural sections. If you go back to 1946, when he purchased the property, most of that was farmland. It was not very well developed, so he had plenty of space, to be flying in and out. He also had the privacy to work in peace. He wouldn't be attracting tons of attention being on a main road with all these inventions in his front yard or landing the planes there or whatnot. So it really was an ideal place for him.
And he also bought some land near Danbury Airport where he tinkered on this. And as I understand it, his first successful test flight of this was at Danbury Airport.
Yeah, that's what I've been told.
The next invention was something to help stranded pilots when they crashed. And, when it comes to this invention of the Skyhook in the 1950s, it's interesting because at one point he said that he was worried about, what would happen if he, crash landed and got stranded somewhere? How could he be rescued? And the idea came from something else. What was that idea?
Yeah, so the idea of how the Skyhook would work actually came to him supposedly when he was observing trains in England. And he was watching the way that the trains had hooks on them that could grab mail bags as they sped by without stopping the train. And this supposedly inspired his design for an object that a plane could lower and drag underneath it at the end of a long rope or cable, which could be used basically to sort of scoop up a downed pilot or intelligence officer or someone who needed to be picked up and extracted while the plane was in motion so that it wouldn't have to find a landing spot. Remember that this is before helicopters really became a main thing. Helicopters would later basically take the place of it. But this Skyhook was really revolutionary for the time.
So now when you think about this, as I understand it, he had a harness that you would wear, a balloon with a helium canister, and a long rope. And the balloon would be tied and fastened to the rope. You put the helium into the balloon, it would go up in the air, and a plane going 150 miles an hour, which is relatively slow, would come over and be able to grab that rope with its hook and pull them up. I mean, and that's just amazing.
It is. And it became successful, too. It was something that the military used up into the 90s. So it got used for many decades.
One of the other great sayings that he had was, great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, and small minds discuss people. It just is, awe-inspiring commentary, and he had a lot of those, didn't he?
He did. He was definitely a very intelligent man and very insightful. Perhaps this was the benefit of all the traveling that he did, all the different cultures that he saw and things that he experienced. But he was definitely somebody who wasn't just mechanically smart, but smart in many other ways as well.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. Now, if you've ever seen the James Bond movie Thunderball, a little bit of a spoiler alert, Robert Fulton's Skyhook system is the one that's used to scoop up 007 from the ocean toward the movie's end. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Ben Cruson, Town Historian for Newtown. Well, the answer to this week's trivia question, the question again, when the Founding Fathers couldn't agree back in 1787 on how to form a new government, which Connecticut statesman diffused the crisis? Well, the answer is Roger Sherman. He was the architect behind what we call the Connecticut Compromise. Well, next week on Amazing Tales CT, We'll look at how Sherman actually got this Connecticut Compromise through and gave us what we have today, the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and please stay healthy.